idea is, instead of seeing the public as participants in our science, what if we see them as partners in science? And the rest of the title is from a book I found on my dad's bookshelf. And my dad was a troublemaker, right? When I was in 5th grade, I asked him what book report I should do, and he gave me the autobiography of Malcolm X. It was cool. He came to school and got me out of trouble later. But, the book was called Small is Beautiful, Economics as If People Mattered, and it introduced the idea of appropriate technology. That it isn't about the latest and greatest technology. It's about technology that's developed with communities, in context that the communities live in, and in partnership with communities. And I think that idea is sort of the thing that I hope threads through the rest of this completely repetitious and redundant talk. So, there's not, as Chris, I think, said earlier, there isn't a huge amount of published literature on sort of citizen science or participatory science or public participation. I think we need to come up with a name here. Like, I think it's not helpful to have 7 different names for the same thing. So if we could agree on a name, that would be awesome. But whatever it's called, there's not a lot of literature about the demographics of it. But I think it's generally true that individuals from historically underrepresented groups participate less than majority groups, and that less affluent members of society outnumber more affluent members of society. I got that backwards. More affluent members of society outnumber less affluent. I'm seeing some nods. This sucks. Right? I mean, all day we've heard about how great citizen science is, how great it is for science, how great it is for program participants. Why are we leaving huge numbers of the population out of this incredible opportunity? And this is a society where knowledge is power, where careers in science and engineering are growing faster than other careers. And so there's a huge group of people who aren't part of that. They're not at the table, and if you're not at the table, you're often on the menu. Right? So this is a problem. The other problem is programs aren't as good without this kind of participation. There's lots of research that suggests the most innovative and creative solutions come from diverse people working together. And we don't have that in citizen science yet. So that's a problem. Incidentally, there's also research that suggests diverse groups are the most likely to explode and not work at all effectively. So there's some management issues there. But if you can get past them, you have the most creative approaches. Right? So it's a problem. Why? Why might we be having this problem? And I think there's not a lot of literature unique to citizen science, but there's a lot of research that looks at the whole breadth of different kinds of science. I'm sorry, I'm looking totally at you guys. I'm paying attention to this side from now on. All right? I still love you, but... So I think there's 3 sorts of general kinds of reasons that come out. One is access. It's stuff like, when does the citizen science campaign, when do informal science campaigns happen? Is that something that's amenable to somebody who's working 3 jobs and trying to get their kids back and forth to school and stuff like that? Some of it's around the fact that a lot of what we do happens in natural settings. Those can be hard to access if you live in an urban environment. Some of it is around the fact that we presume a certain level of scientific knowledge. That can be a little bit of a barrier if you're brand new to science and scientific processes. Those, I think, are the easy ones to fix. It gets a little harder as you go down the list. Culture, I think, is huge. Some of this is as simple as critical mass. If there aren't a lot of people of color in the program, it feels weird to be the first or second or third person of color in a program. So this we can solve with time, with effort. Unfamiliar practices. I don't think we mean to, but when you get a group of people designing a project, they tend to design it with their background sort of implicitly setting up the norms, setting up the expectations. So until we start designing with these diverse communities, we're going to accidentally design sort of, for lack of a better word, whitey programs. And I didn't mean that in an offensive way, but okay. I mean, I'm not, like I often tell people I'm not, like one of my goals is to grow up to be a middle-aged white man. And it's going well. And then one really hard one is divergent values. And I think about this a lot. And the best example I can give you is that Stephen Gould, right, talks about how we can reconcile religion and science. And he introduces this like 2-book model, or the kind of different domains of knowledge model. And he says that, I have one book that I look to when I want to think about how to live an ethical life, and I have another book that I look to when I want to think about how the world's created. That totally doesn't work for indigenous cultures, right? Because it's dividing knowledge into parts. Albert Whitehat, who is a Lakota elder, said we didn't have a religion. we had a way of life. Economic, pragmatic, practical, spiritual, it was all one worldview. So those are big cultural hurdles that we need to take seriously as we design these things. And finally, relevance. Right? I meet a lot of students who say, I really want to help my community. I'm good at science, I'm good at math, I'm going to be a doctor. Right? And we need to do better than that. There's an amazing story about this. This is a true story. It's about a guy who's in graduate school, and he comes back from graduate school every summer, and his grandmother has him sit down and tell him what he's doing in graduate school. And each summer he does it, and his grandmother nods at the end of every summer and says, grandson, this is great work, go back to graduate school. Every summer it gets a little harder to explain what he's doing. Finally, one summer he says, Grandma, I can't do it. I'm sorry, I can't do it. It's like too technical, it's too narrow. There are words I'm using that don't even translate into our language. And his grandmother nods and says, grandson, it's time to come home. Right? If what you're doing can't even be translated into our language, how can it be useful to our people? And I think about that story, and I think about how it might have been different. And it's a true story, by the way. And the ultimate irony of the story, the person it's about was majoring in science education. Right? He couldn't translate that. But I think about that story, and I think what would have been different if instead of coming back from graduate school to tell his grandmother what he learned, he had gone to graduate school to tell them what his grandmother knew. And he had designed his research around those community priorities. And that's why I come down so hard on this side of co-creation of knowledge. That idea that I think Linda talked about and Heidi talked about a little bit this morning. And so I want to give you some examples of what that might look like. These are just some examples I know about, chosen for no other reason than I have a limited capacity to know about things. So these are the ones I know about. So this is a project we sent a student down to the Louisiana Delta. And the Louisiana Delta is an area of extreme land loss for a whole bunch of reasons, anthropogenic and natural, all combining. And she lived in the community and worked in the community for 10 weeks this summer. And with the community, she defined this project that she calls Vanishing Points. It's not done yet. This is sort of a prototype. But it's going to be an iPhone app where community members will select culturally, historically, ceremonially important points and be able to collect stories, videos, testimonials about those points, be able to locate them on a map, and then be able to look at projections of what's likely to happen to those locations under different scenarios. It also links to places where you can get involved in action if you want to get involved in that. So that's one project. Second project happened on the White Earth Nation in Minnesota, and it's around wild rice, trying to understand the current and future distribution of wild rice. And it's a project that integrates a whole bunch of different community priorities. There's priorities around youth engagement, there's priorities around nutrition and health, there's priorities around cultural succession and progression and evolution. I don't want to say cultural preservation, right? Because that sounds like you're under siege, and that's not the mindset that this community wants to have about itself. There's priorities around all those things, and it's run by the community college, the White Earth Community College. Third project actually took place in Africa, and it takes place in the Sahel, which is this transition zone between the sort of Sahara Desert and the more moist, sort of tropical. It's an area with a distinct wet, dry season. And left? Ouch. All right, I guess I better turn over here for a while. Right? So it's an area with a distinct wet, dry season, and what they found is that meningitis is epidemic in this area. Every couple of years, for no apparent reason, meningitis cases spike. Last time was in 2008, 88,000 people contracted meningitis, 5,000 people died, 5,000 people ended up permanently disabled. And everyone who lives there, everyone will tell you that it's a dry season problem, and once the rains start, it's over. So our project was really simple. We worked with the community to try to better forecast the start of the rainy season. If you know where it's going to rain, you know where you don't have to vaccinate, because of course there's not enough vaccines, and you can allocate the vaccines to other places. Right? So those are 3 examples of doing science with communities. And what I wanted to do in the last 4 minutes is draw out some sort of general ideas around how you can do this. Right? It's a suggested framework. So the first part is to align research with community priorities. It seems pretty basic, but it takes a long time. Two big problems there. Community priorities are never singularly disciplined, right? So all of a sudden you gotta work in multidisciplinary teams. I don't know about you, but I wasn't trained to work with anybody and it shows. But so this is a new way of thinking about how you do science. Somebody mentioned humility earlier today, and I think this is really where humility has a huge impact. The other part is community priorities mean talking to a lot of different community members. There was a project in Nepal where they were looking at how they could help the community cope with this periodic flooding that was happening and was going to happen more and more often. It was a community that lived in semi-permanent housing, and they did focus group after focus group after focus group, and they were leaning pretty hard towards building some seawalls or some walls that would contain the river. They finally did a focus group of only women, right? And the women who weren't speaking in the mixed focus groups, but were speaking in the private focus groups, said the problem isn't really the water per se, right? We need that water, we need access, building these walls is a bad idea. The problem is that the flooding leads to sewage contamination, and then our kids get sick. So if we could deal with the sewage, we wouldn't mind the flooding. So it completely changed the course of the intervention, and they ended up working on a sewage treatment plant together instead, right? So community means every part of the community, and that can be a challenge. Second part is you got to plan for co-management. Something's going to go wrong, right, eventually. And if you don't have a plan for how you're going to deal with that with the community, you're hosed. Right? And the White Earth example was really nice because the tribal college is chartered by the tribal council. So there was a direct way to plan for this kind of co-management. If there's not that way, I think it's incumbent upon the researchers to try to build that relationship and build that co-management strategy. Chris, you did a great job talking about incorporating multiple kinds of knowledge. So I don't think I'm going to say much more about this except to harken back to that theme of humility. Right? One of the things that's tough, I think, for scientists is wanting to have their expertise be relevant and important to the project. You need to also make space for other kinds of expertise to be relevant and important to the project. And I think this will stretch, it stretched me in ways that are really, really, I hope, good for me, but painful in the process. I think you're right. You have to be uncomfortable to learn. So, communicate. This is a big one. This is one of our interns. This is our intern, and these are all the different places she communicated. You can see a lot of it happened in really small one-on-one settings. This is why it took 6 months or 6 weeks of constant day-to-day work to even begin to define a project that she would do with the community. I think too often we think about sort of outreach as sort of the end product of science, and what I'm arguing here is that that communication should be the end product of science as well, and so that communication needs to happen at every step. If I had to wrap it all up, I would say it's really about engaging the community in every single step of the process. Thank you. I think I'm going to make it. So it's about engaging the community in every single step of the process, from defining the scientific question to deciding what kind of things count as data, what data means. That somebody mentioned anecdotal data. I think we have to be careful about dismissing certain kinds of data as anecdotal. That sounds really dismissive to some communities. So it's about all of that. It's about agreeing to what counts as data, how the data will be collected, when the data will be collected, even what data is appropriate to share is an important consideration, all the way through to actually working with communities to help apply that data to the problem. I don't think you can leave once the science part is done and leave the community on its own to decide how to solve it or how to apply it. And with that, I've got to stop. So the message I want to leave you with is by paying even more attention to doing science with people, I think citizen science can provide a model for science in general that's more relevant and more useful. Thank you.